3 chilling true elevator horror stories. Welcome back to Dark Whispers, where the ordinary becomes terrifying and the mundane transforms into nightmares. I'm your host, and tonight we're exploring one of the most claustrophobic fears known to humanity, being trapped in an elevator. Think about it. Every day, millions of people step into these metal boxes, trusting their lives to cables and machinery. We press a button, the doors close, and for those brief moments, we're suspended between floors, hanging in a shaft hundreds of feet above the ground. But what happens when that routine trip goes horribly wrong? Tonight, I'm sharing 3 deeply disturbing true stories that will make you think twice before stepping into an elevator again. These aren't urban legends or creepypasta. These are real events that happen to real people. Ordinary individuals who thought they were just going up a few floors, never imagining they'd experience something that would haunt them forever. From mysterious strangers appearing in sealed elevators, to terrifying malfunctions that trap people in the dark, to encounters that defy all logical explanation, these stories will chill you to your core. Before we begin, if you enjoy true horror stories and want to hear more terrifying tales, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you don't want to miss what we have coming next. And if you're brave enough to make it through all 3 stories, leave a comment telling me which one disturbed you the most. Now turn down the lights, put on your headphones, and prepare yourself. Because once you hear these stories, you'll never look at an elevator the same way again. Let's begin with our first story. Story 1. The Night Shift. Sarah Mitchell was a dedicated nurse at Mercy General Hospital in downtown Seattle. For 3 years, she'd worked the night shift in the intensive care unit on the 7th floor, and she'd grown accustomed to the eerie quiet that settled over the hospital after midnight. The empty hallways, the flickering fluorescent lights, the distant beeping of monitors, it was all part of her routine. The hospital itself was an imposing structure, built in 1952, with that distinctive mid-century architecture that somehow managed to look both grand and unsettling. The elevator system was original to the building, though it had been updated several times over the decades. There were 3 elevators in the main bank, but after 10 p.m., only one remained operational to save on power. This was Elevator B, the middle one, and Sarah had ridden it thousands of times without incident. It was a Tuesday night in October when everything changed. Sarah's shift had been particularly exhausting. They'd admitted 2 critical patients, and she'd spent hours on her feet, running between rooms, administering medications, and comforting worried family members. By 3:30 in the morning, she was desperate for a coffee break. The hospital cafeteria was closed, but there was a vending machine area in the basement level, just past the old morgue that had been converted into storage rooms decades ago. Sarah normally avoided the basement. It had a reputation among the staff for being creepy, but her need for caffeine overpowered her unease. She walked to the elevator bay and pressed the call button. The floor indicator showed that elevator B was on the 4th floor. She watched the numbers descend. 4, 3, 2, 1. The bell chimed softly, and the doors slid open with their characteristic metallic groan. The elevator was empty, just as she expected. Sarah stepped inside, pressed the button for the basement level, and leaned back against the wall as the doors closed. The elevator lurched slightly as it began its descent, a familiar sensation that she barely noticed anymore. But then, between the 6th and 5th floors, the elevator shuddered violently. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went completely dark. Sarah's heart jumped into her throat as the elevator came to an abrupt stop, throwing her slightly off balance. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in a dim, reddish glow that made the small space feel even more confined. "Not again," Sarah muttered, reaching for the emergency call button. This had happened once before, about 6 months ago, and maintenance had gotten the elevator running again within 20 minutes. She pressed the button and waited for the reassuring voice of hospital security. Instead, she heard only static, a harsh, crackling sound that made her pull her hand back from the panel. Sarah tried her cell phone next, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. Elevator shafts were notorious dead zones. She'd just have to wait for someone to notice the elevator was stuck. That's when she heard it. A sound from above her, from somewhere in the darkness of the elevator shaft. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the building's ventilation system. A scraping sound, like metal on metal, rhythmic and deliberate. Sarah looked up at the ceiling panel, suddenly aware of how flimsy it looked. The scraping continued, growing louder, closer. And then it stopped. In the absolute silence that followed, Sarah's breathing sounded impossibly loud. She pressed herself against the back wall of the elevator, her eyes fixed on the ceiling panel. The emergency lighting cast strange shadows across the textured metal surface, making it hard to see clearly. Then the panel moved. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift to one side as if something had bumped it from above. Sarah's mouth went dry. She wanted to call out to ask if someone was there, but the words stuck in her throat. The panel moved again, this time more deliberately, sliding several inches to the left. Through the gap, Sarah could see only darkness, a void that seemed to absorb the red emergency light rather than reflect it. And then she saw something else. A pale shape descending slowly through the opening. It took her a moment to recognize what she was seeing. It was a hand. But not a normal hand. The fingers were too long, the joints bending at odd angles. The skin was corpse white, almost translucent in the dim light, and as it stretched down toward her, Sarah could see dark veins running beneath the surface like cracks in marble. She opened her mouth to scream, but before any sound could emerge, the elevator lurched back to life. The lights snapped on, blindingly bright after the darkness, and the elevator began to descend. Sarah looked up at the ceiling panel, blinking against the sudden illumination. The panel was perfectly in place, undisturbed. There was no gap, no opening, and no hand. The elevator chimed as it reached the 5th floor. Apparently it had been stuck between floors after all. The doors opened onto an empty hallway, fluorescent lights humming their eternal tune. Sarah stood frozen in the elevator, her heart hammering against her ribs, trying to reconcile what she'd seen with the mundane reality now before her. She didn't get her coffee that night. Instead, she took the stairs back to the 7th floor, her legs shaking with every step. She told herself it had been her imagination, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the disorienting effect of the emergency lighting. But deep down, she knew what she'd seen. The next day, Sarah spoke to one of the older nurses, a woman named Dorothy who'd worked at Mercy General for over 30 years. When Sarah mentioned the incident, carefully omitting the more disturbing details, Dorothy's expression changed. "You were in elevator B?" Dorothy asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper despite the busy nurses station around them. Sarah nodded. Dorothy pulled her aside, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "There's a reason I always take the stairs at night," she said. "That elevator has a history." According to Dorothy, back in 1978, a maintenance worker named Gerald Pritchard had been performing routine work in the elevator shaft. He'd been standing on top of elevator B, which was stationary on the ground floor, when someone on the 7th floor called for the elevator. The safety protocols that should have prevented the elevator from moving failed. Gerald had been crushed against the ceiling of the shaft when the elevator ascended. His body wasn't discovered for 3 hours. When they finally brought the elevator down and retrieved him, the other maintenance workers reported that his arms had been bent at impossible angles, as if he'd been desperately trying to squeeze through a space that was far too small. Ever since then, Dorothy continued, people have reported strange things happening in that elevator, especially during the night shift. Unusual sounds, sudden stops, and some people, those who've been stuck in it between floors, they've reported seeing things. Things reaching down from above. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She hadn't told Dorothy about the hand. "The hospital administration denies there's any problem," Dorothy said with a bitter laugh. "They've had the elevator inspected dozens of times. Mechanically it's perfectly sound. But I'll tell you this, I knew Gerald Pritchard. He was a good man dedicated to his work. And if his spirit is trapped in that shaft, I don't think he's at peace." After that conversation, Sarah requested a transfer to the day shift. Her supervisor was surprised. Sarah had always preferred nights, but approved the request without much fuss. Sarah never rode elevator B again, and she made it a point to use the stairs whenever possible, even though climbing 7 flights was exhausting. But here's what Sarah didn't tell anyone, not even Dorothy. what she couldn't bring herself to say out loud. In those final seconds before the lights came back on, before the elevator started moving again, Sarah had looked up one more time. And in that brief moment she'd seen not just the hand, but a face in the darkness above the panel. A pale, distorted face with hollow eyes and a mouth open in a silent scream. And the expression on that face wasn't one of anger or malice. It was terror. Pure, absolute terror. As if Gerald Pritchard was still trapped in that moment of horrific death, crushed and desperate, reaching out endlessly for help that would never come. Sarah left Mercy General 6 months later and moved to a different city. She works at a small clinic now, a single-story building with no elevators at all. She's never told anyone the complete story of what happened that night. But sometimes in her dreams she's back in that elevator, watching the ceiling panel slide open, seeing that impossibly long hand reaching down toward her in the red emergency light. And in those dreams, the hand always touches her before she wakes up screaming. Story 2, the CARLTON Building. Marcus Webb was a security guard at the CARLTON Building in downtown Chicago, one of those classic 1920s office towers that had somehow survived decades of urban development. 23 stories of Art Deco architecture, ornate brass fixtures, and a lobby with marble floors that echoed with every footstep. It was the kind of building that looked impressive in daylight but took on a different character after dark. Marcus had been working there for almost 2 years, primarily doing overnight shifts from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The job was usually quiet, too quiet sometimes. The building was mostly empty at night, save for a few workaholics and the cleaning crew that came through between midnight and 4 a.m. Marcus would make his rounds every hour, checking doors, monitoring the security cameras, and mostly trying to stay awake. The CARLTON Building had 4 elevators arranged in a bank in the main lobby. They were original to the building, though they'd been modernized several times over the decades. The cars still had that old-fashioned elegance, polished brass rails, wood paneling, and floor indicators with actual needles that swept across a semicircular dial. During business hours, all 4 elevators ran continuously, but at night, the building management shut down 3 of them to save on electricity and maintenance costs. The only operational elevator at night was number 3, and Marcus had a particular routine with it. Part of his hourly rounds involved taking the elevator to the top floor and then working his way down via the stairs, checking each floor as he went. It was good exercise and helped him stay alert during the long, tedious nights. It was a Friday in late November when Marcus's routine was shattered forever. The night had started normally enough. He checked in with his supervisor via radio at 11:30, confirmed that the cleaning crew had arrived, and settled into his chair at the security desk to review the camera feeds. Around 1:15 a.m., Marcus began his first round of the night. He walked across the echoing lobby to the elevator bank and pressed the call button for elevator number 3. The building was silent except for the distant hum of the HVAC system and the occasional faint sound of vacuum cleaners from somewhere high above. The elevator arrived with its characteristic chime, and Marcus stepped inside. He pressed the button for the 23rd floor and leaned against the back wall as the doors closed. The elevator began its ascent with a gentle lurch, the floor indicator needle swinging smoothly across the dial. 15, 16, 17. Marcus watched the numbers climb, mentally preparing himself for the long walk down 23 flights of stairs. The elevator was moving smoothly, no unusual sounds or vibrations. Everything was perfectly normal. 20, 21, 22. The elevator chimed and came to a stop on the 23rd floor. Marcus straightened up, ready to step out and begin his inspection of the top floor. The doors slid open. But instead of the familiar hallway of executive offices, Marcus found himself staring at a floor he'd never seen before. The hallway was different, wrong. The walls were covered in dark wallpaper with an intricate, almost nauseating pattern of swirls and geometric shapes. The lighting was dim and yellowish, coming from old-fashioned wall sconces that cast flickering shadows. The carpet was a deep burgundy color, worn in places, and there was a smell in the air, musty and stale, like a room that hadn't been opened in decades. Marcus stood frozen in the elevator, his hand instinctively moving to the radio on his belt. This couldn't be right. He'd been to the 23rd floor dozens of times. It had cream-colored walls, modern LED lighting, and industrial gray carpet. It certainly didn't look like something out of a 1920s hotel. He glanced at the floor indicator inside the elevator. The needle pointed firmly at the number 23. He was on the right floor, or at least the elevator thought he was. "Hello?" Marcus called out, his voice sounding strange and muffled in the unfamiliar space. There was no response, just the faint buzzing of the wall sconces. Marcus's training kicked in. If there was some kind of problem, a gas leak causing hallucinations, or maybe some bizarre renovation he hadn't been informed about, he needed to report it immediately. He reached for his radio. "Base, this is Marcus. I'm on the 23rd floor and something's not right. The floor looks completely different from usual. Requesting immediate backup." He released the button and waited for a response. Nothing. Not even static. Marcus checked the radio. It was on, the battery indicator showed a full charge, but it was completely silent. He tried again. "Base, do you copy? This is Marcus on 23. Still nothing." Marcus looked at his cell phone. No signal, which wasn't unusual in the center of the building. But combined with the radio failure and the bizarre change in the floor's appearance, it was deeply unsettling. He made a decision. He would get back in the elevator, return to the lobby, and get help. Whatever was happening here, he wasn't going to investigate it alone. Marcus turned back toward the elevator. The doors were closing. Wait. He lunged forward, his hand shooting out to trigger the safety sensor. But his hand passed through the closing doors as if they weren't there, and they slid shut with a final, definitive click. Marcus stood staring at the closed elevator doors, his heart beginning to pound. He pressed the call button on the wall, jabbing it repeatedly. The button didn't light up. He pressed it harder, then tried the emergency button next to it. Nothing. "Okay," Marcus said aloud, trying to keep his voice steady. "Okay, this is fine. I'll take the stairs." He turned around and surveyed the hallway more carefully. It extended in both directions, lined with doors that looked like they belonged in a vintage hotel rather than an office building. Each door had a brass number plate, but the numbers made no sense. The nearest door was labeled 23 to 7, and beyond it he could see 23 to 9, 23 to 11, following an odd-numbered sequence. Marcus walked toward what he hoped was the stairwell, his footsteps muffled by the burgundy carpet. As he moved down the hallway, he noticed other details that increased his unease. The wallpaper pattern seemed to shift and move in his peripheral vision, though when he looked directly at it, it was perfectly still. Some of the wall sconces flickered more than others, and a few appeared to be burned out entirely, creating pools of deeper shadow. He passed several of the numbered doors, resisting the urge to try any of them. His only goal was to find the stairs and get back down to the lobby. The stairwell should be at the end of the hallway. It was in the same location on every floor. But when Marcus reached what should have been the stairwell door, he found instead another hallway stretching off at a right angle. This corridor looked identical to the first. Same dark wallpaper, same flickering sconces, same worn burgundy carpet. More doors with odd numbers. 23 to 45, 23 to 47, 23 to 49. "This doesn't make sense," Marcus muttered. The building's floor plan was straightforward. He knew it by heart. Each floor was roughly rectangular, with offices around the perimeter and a central core containing the elevators, stairwells, and utilities. You couldn't have these long, extended hallways. There wasn't room for them. Marcus pulled out his phone and opened the compass app, thinking he could at least figure out which direction he was facing. The compass spun wildly, the needle swinging from north to south and back again without settling on any direction. A door opened somewhere behind him. Marcus spun around, his hand going to the flashlight on his belt. The hallway behind him was empty, but one of the doors, 23 to 11 he thought, though he couldn't be sure, was now slightly ajar. Yellowish light spilled through the gap, and Marcus could hear something from inside. Music. Old-fashioned jazz, the kind with lots of brass and that scratchy quality of an antique recording. And beneath the music, voices. People talking, laughing, the clink of glasses. Marcus approached the door cautiously. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to find another way out, but he was drawn forward by a combination of curiosity and the desperate hope that whoever was inside could help him. He pushed the door open wider and looked inside. The room beyond was impossible. There was a massive ballroom, far larger than the entire floor should have been. The ceiling soared at least 20 feet high, decorated with ornate molding and crystal chandeliers that cast dancing light across a polished parquet floor. The walls were lined with tall windows, though the curtains were drawn, and there were dozens of small tables scattered around the perimeter of the room. And it was full of people. Men in tuxedos and women in elegant gowns from the 1920s era crowded the space, dancing, drinking, socializing. The jazz band he'd heard was set up on a small stage at the far end of the room, the musicians swaying as they played. Everyone looked happy, carefree, lost in the revelry of what appeared to be a lavish party. Marcus stood in the doorway, completely dumbfounded. How could any of this exist in the Carlton building? Where had all these people come from? And why were they dressed like extras from a Gatsby movie? One of the women near the door turned and looked directly at Marcus. She was young, maybe 25, with bobbed hair and dark lipstick. She smiled at him, a bright, welcoming smile, and raised her glass in a toast. Marcus took an involuntary step backward. The woman's smile didn't falter, but something changed in her eyes. They darkened, the pupils expanding until her entire eyes were black, like a shark's eyes. And then her skin began to change too, becoming pale, almost translucent. The other partygoers were turning now, one by one, to look at Marcus. They all had the same black eyes, the same pale, wrong skin. And as Marcus watched in horror, their smiles grew wider, stretching their faces in ways that shouldn't be possible. Marcus stumbled backward out of the doorway and slammed the door shut. His hands were shaking as he backed away, his breath coming in short gasps. The music continued behind the door, but it sounded different now, distorted, playing at the wrong speed with an underlying tone that made his skin crawl. He turned and ran. Marcus sprinted down the hallway, no longer caring about finding the stairwell in an orderly fashion. He just needed to get away from that room, from those things with their impossible smiles and dead eyes. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, doors flying past in his peripheral vision. Some of them were opening as he passed, spilling yellowish light and strange sounds into the corridor. Finally he saw it ahead, an elevator. Not the elevator bank that should have been in the center of the building, but a single elevator with brass doors, standing alone at the end of the hallway. Marcus didn't care about the impossibility of it. He lunged forward and hammered on the call button. Miraculously, the elevator chimed immediately. The doors opened and Marcus threw himself inside, spinning around to press the button for the lobby. The doors began to close, but not fast enough. Marcus could see figures emerging from the rooms along the hallway, pale shapes in formal wear, moving with an odd, jerky gait, all converging toward the elevator. The doors closed just as the first figure reached them. Marcus could hear them on the other side, not pounding or scratching, but something worse. Whispering. Dozens of voices whispering in unison, the words unintelligible but filled with a terrible longing. The elevator began to descend. Marcus watched the floor indicator needle swing across the dial, praying that it would take him back to the real lobby, the real world, away from whatever nightmare floor he'd stumbled onto. 23, 22, 21. The descent seemed to take forever, but finally the needle reached the L for lobby. The elevator chimed and the doors opened. Marcus found himself looking at the familiar marble floors and brass fixtures of the Carlton building's main lobby. The security desk was visible across the space, and everything looked exactly as it should. He stepped out of the elevator on shaking legs and turned to look back at it. It was elevator number 4. Not number 3, which was the only one that should have been operational. Elevator 4 was supposed to be shut down for the night. Marcus approached his security desk and collapsed into the chair. His hands were still trembling as he pulled up the building's security camera footage on his monitor. He scrolled back to 1:15 a.m., when he'd started his rounds. The footage showed him entering elevator number 3 in the lobby. The timestamp continued, 1:16, 1:17, 1:18, but there was no footage of him exiting on any floor. At 1:47, the camera showed him stepping out of elevator number 4 in the lobby, looking disheveled and panicked. He'd been gone for 32 minutes, but there was no record of where he'd been. Marcus spent the rest of his shift at the desk, refusing to leave the lobby. When his replacement arrived at 7 a.m., Marcus tried to explain what had happened, but the words sounded insane even to his own ears. His colleague listened with barely concealed skepticism and suggested that Marcus might have fallen asleep and had a vivid dream. But Marcus knew better. The next day he researched the history of the CARLTON building. What he found made his blood run cold. In 1929, the building's 23rd floor had housed an exclusive speakeasy, an illegal bar during Prohibition. On New Year's Eve of that year, during a massive party celebrating the end of the decade, a fire had broken out. The exits were blocked, and the windows were sealed to prevent police raids. 47 people died that night, trapped in the ballroom as smoke and flames consumed them. The floor had been completely renovated after the tragedy, all evidence of the speakeasy removed. But according to several accounts Marcus found in old newspapers, people had reported strange experiences on that floor for years afterward. Unexplained sounds, visual anomalies, and feelings of overwhelming dread. The reports had gradually stopped, or perhaps people just stopped reporting them. Marcus handed in his resignation that afternoon. He never went back to the CARLTON building, never even drove past it if he could avoid it. He took a job at a shopping mall, a modern, single-story building where the worst thing he had to deal with was shoplifters and teenagers loitering after hours. But sometimes, even now, Marcus will be in an elevator somewhere, any elevator, and he'll feel a moment of disorientation. The lights will flicker or the elevator will pause for just a second too long between floors. And in those moments, he'll grip the rail tightly and stare at the floor indicator, terrified that the needle will swing past the building's highest floor and point to a number that shouldn't exist. Because he knows now that there are places between places, floors that exist in the gaps of reality. And once you've visited one of those impossible spaces, once you've seen what dwells there, you can never quite trust that the elevator you're in will take you where you expect to go. You can only hope that when the doors open, you'll recognize the world on the other side. Story 3, The Descent. Jennifer Zhao was a resident in her final year of medical training at Metropolitan Hospital in downtown Boston. At 28 years old, she was accustomed to high-stress situations, long hours, and functioning on minimal sleep. The medical profession demanded resilience, and Jennifer had it in spades. But nothing in her training prepared her for what happened on a cold night in March. Metropolitan Hospital was a sprawling complex, a maze of interconnected buildings that had been constructed, expanded, and renovated over the course of nearly a century. The oldest section dated back to the 1920s, while the newest wing had been completed just 5 years ago. The result was a confusing layout that even longtime staff members sometimes struggled to navigate. Jennifer worked primarily in the East Wing, a relatively modern building completed in the 1980s. It was 12 stories tall, housing various departments including oncology, cardiology, and the surgical suites. The elevator system was equally complex. There were multiple elevator banks serving different sections of the building, and understanding which elevator went where required a learning curve that took most new staff members weeks to master. On this particular night, Jennifer had been assisting with a complicated cardiac surgery that had gone on for nearly 8 hours. By the time she left the surgical suite, it was almost 2 a.m. She was exhausted, her feet aching, and she still had paperwork to complete before she could go home. Her next stop was the medical records office on the second floor, where she needed to retrieve a patient file. Jennifer walked through the mostly empty corridors to the nearest elevator bank. This particular bank had 3 elevators, all of which served floors 1 through 12. She pressed the call button and waited, leaning against the wall and suppressing a yawn. The middle elevator arrived first, its doors sliding open with a soft chime. Jennifer stepped inside, pressed the button for the second floor, and leaned back as the doors closed. The elevator began to descend. She'd been on the 5th floor, and Jennifer closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself a moment of rest. The elevator chimed, signaling its arrival at the 2nd floor. Jennifer opened her eyes and straightened up, ready to step out. But the doors didn't open. Jennifer frowned and pressed the door open button. Nothing happened. She pressed it again, harder this time, and then pressed the button for the second floor again for good measure. The elevator sat motionless, the floor indicator clearly showing at 2, but the doors remained firmly closed. "Great," Jennifer muttered. She'd heard of this happening before. Some glitch in the door mechanism that required maintenance to fix. It was annoying but not particularly concerning. She pressed the emergency call button. A burst of static came through the speaker, followed by a garbled voice. Jennifer couldn't make out any words, just distorted sounds that might have been human speech. "Hello," Jennifer said, speaking clearly toward the speaker. "This is Dr. Zhao in elevator." She looked around for an elevator number. "I'm not sure which number. I'm in the East Wing elevator bank, stuck on the second floor. The doors won't open." More static, and then what might have been a response, but the words were completely unintelligible. "I can't understand you," Jennifer said, trying to keep the frustration out of her voice. "The communication system seems to be malfunctioning. I'm going to try to get to another floor." She pressed the button for the third floor. The elevator didn't move. She tried the first floor, then the fourth. Nothing. The elevator remained stationary, the floor indicator stubbornly displaying the number 2. Jennifer pulled out her cell phone. No signal, which was typical in the center of the building. She'd have to wait for someone to notice the elevator was malfunctioning or for the maintenance team to do a routine check. She was about to sit down on the floor to wait when the elevator suddenly lurched. Not upward or downward, but sideways, as if something had struck it from the side. Jennifer stumbled, catching herself against the wall. Her heart rate, which had been slow with exhaustion, suddenly kicked up. "What the hell?" she whispered. The elevator lurched again, more violently this time. Jennifer heard a grinding sound from somewhere above her, metal scraping against metal. The lights flickered, and for a terrifying moment she thought they would go out entirely. But they steadied, though now they seemed dimmer than before. And then the elevator began to move. But it wasn't moving up or down. It was moving backward, or at least that's how it felt. Jennifer couldn't see anything changing, couldn't see any indication of motion, but her inner ear was telling her that she was moving, that the elevator was traveling in a direction that elevators shouldn't go. The floor indicator needle began to spin. It swept past 2, past 1, and then continued moving counterclockwise. It passed through 0 and kept going, pointing to negative numbers that shouldn't exist on the dial. -1, -2, -3. "No, no, no," Jennifer said, pressing buttons randomly now, trying to make the elevator stop. But it continued its impossible descent, the needle sweeping past -4, -5, -6. The temperature in the elevator dropped precipitously. Jennifer could see her breath fogging in the air. The walls seemed to close in, or maybe that was just her imagination. The lighting had taken on a greenish tinge, casting sickly shadows across the brushed metal interior. -10, -11, -12. The elevator finally came to a stop at -15. -15. 15 floors below the ground floor, which was impossible. Metropolitan Hospital had a basement level and a sub-basement for utilities and storage. 2 floors below ground, not 15. The doors opened. Jennifer stood frozen, staring at what lay beyond the elevator. It was a corridor, but not like any hospital corridor she'd ever seen. The walls were concrete, rough and unfinished, with strange stains that might have been water damage or might have been something else. The floor was concrete too, cracked and uneven. And the lighting was wrong. It didn't come from any visible source. Instead, it seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a pale, phosphorescent glow that barely pushed back the darkness. Jennifer's rational mind, her medical training, everything that had gotten her through years of education and residency, it all screamed at her not to step out of that elevator. Whatever this place was, it wasn't a normal part of the hospital. It wasn't a normal part of reality. But the elevator doors began to close again, and Jennifer realized that if she didn't step out, she might be taken somewhere even worse. She lunged forward, just barely making it through the doors before they shut behind her. The sound of the elevator ascending was like a death knell. Jennifer spun around and hammered on the elevator call button set into the concrete wall, but there was no response. The button didn't light up, didn't trigger any mechanism. It was as dead as everything else in this place. Jennifer took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She was a doctor. She dealt with crises every day. She could handle this. She just needed to find another way out, stairs, another elevator, something. She turned around and surveyed the corridor more carefully. It extended in only one direction, sloping slightly downward. The phosphorescent glow from the walls was barely enough to see by, creating more shadows than it eliminated. Jennifer pulled out her phone, thinking she could use it as a flashlight, but the screen was black. Dead, even though it had been fully charged just minutes ago. "Okay," Jennifer said aloud, her voice sounding small and lost in the oppressive silence. "Okay, I'm going to find a way out." She started walking down the corridor, one hand trailing along the rough concrete wall. The silence was absolute. No hum of ventilation systems, no distant sounds of the hospital above, nothing. Just her footsteps, echoing slightly, and her own breathing. The corridor continued for what felt like a long time, though Jennifer had lost all sense of distance. It curved occasionally, always sloping slightly downward. She passed openings in the walls, doorways without doors, leading into dark chambers that she couldn't bring herself to explore. And then she started seeing things in those chambers. At first, it was just shapes in the darkness, indistinct forms that might have been equipment or furniture. But as Jennifer continued, the shapes became more defined. In one room, she saw what looked like an old surgical table, the kind that hadn't been used in decades. Straps hung from its sides and dark stains covered the metal surface. In another room, she saw rows of gurneys, each one occupied by a shape covered with a sheet. The sheets didn't move, but Jennifer had the horrible feeling that if she entered the room and pulled back one of those sheets, she would find something looking back at her. She walked faster, no longer trailing her hand along the wall, focused only on finding an exit. The corridor had to lead somewhere. Had to. Voices. Jennifer stopped abruptly. Somewhere ahead, she could hear voices. They were faint, distorted, but definitely human. Or at least they sounded human. Jennifer couldn't make out words, but the rhythm of conversation was there, the rise and fall of sentences, the pause for response. Against every instinct that told her to turn back, Jennifer moved toward the voices. They were coming from an opening in the wall up ahead, one of the larger doorways that seemed to lead into a more substantial room. As she approached, the voices became clearer. She could hear what sounded like a conversation between multiple people. Doctors, maybe, discussing a patient. The terminology was medical, the tone professional. It was so startlingly normal compared to everything else in this nightmare place that Jennifer felt a surge of hope. She reached the doorway and looked inside. The room was a hospital ward, but from another era. The beds were old-fashioned iron frames with thin mattresses, arranged in two neat rows. Medical equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum sat on rolling carts between the beds. And there were people, doctors and nurses in vintage uniforms, moving between the beds, tending to patients. Jennifer's hope faltered. Something was wrong with the scene, though she couldn't immediately identify what. The medical staff moved with odd, jerky motions like footage played at the wrong frame rate. And the patients in the beds, she couldn't see their faces. They were turned away from her, or covered with sheets pulled up high, or obscured by the staff leaning over them. One of the nurses turned and looked directly at Jennifer. The woman's face was young, pretty, with her hair done up in the style of the 1940s or 50s. She smiled at Jennifer, a welcoming, professional smile. "Doctor," the nurse said, and her voice had an echoing quality as if it were coming from far away. "We've been waiting for you. We have so many patients who need your help." Jennifer took a step backward. The nurse's smile didn't waver, but her eyes were wrong. They had no whites, no irises, just solid black orbs that reflected the sickly light from the walls. "No," Jennifer said. "I'm not supposed to be here." The other medical staff in the ward stopped their movements and turned to look at her. All of them had the same black eyes. And now Jennifer could see the patients too as they sat up in their beds and turned toward her. Their hospital gowns were stained with things that might have been blood or worse. Their faces were pale, sunken, with the same empty black eyes. "Please, doctor," the nurse said, still smiling that horrible smile. "They've been waiting so long. We've all been waiting so long." The staff and patients began moving toward the doorway. Not running, but walking with that same jerky, unnatural gait. Jennifer turned and ran. She sprinted back the way she'd come, her exhaustion forgotten in a flood of adrenaline and terror. Behind her, she could hear them following, not running but walking steadily, relentlessly. And they were talking, all of them, their voices overlapping in a horrible chorus. "Doctor, please help us. We need you, doctor. Don't leave us down here. Help us, help us, help us." Jennifer ran blindly, no longer trying to navigate, just desperate to get away. The corridor twisted and turned, and she passed more doorways spilling that greenish phosphorescent light. In her peripheral vision, she saw more shapes emerging from those rooms, joining the procession behind her. And then, impossibly, she saw it ahead, an elevator. A single elevator set into the concrete wall, its doors closed, a call button glowing with a faint red light. Jennifer threw herself at the button, pressing it repeatedly. Behind her, the voices grew louder, closer. She could hear footsteps now, dozens of them, echoing through the corridor. "Come on, come on, come on," Jennifer pleaded. The elevator chimed. The doors began to open. Jennifer didn't wait for them to fully open. She squeezed through the gap as soon as it was wide enough and immediately began pressing the button for the first floor. The doors seemed to close agonizingly slowly, and through the narrowing gap, Jennifer could see them approaching. An army of figures in vintage medical uniforms and hospital gowns, all with those terrible black eyes, all reaching toward her. The doors closed with inches to spare. Jennifer collapsed against the back wall of the elevator, gasping for breath. The elevator began to rise, and she watched the floor indicator needle swing upward through the negative numbers, through 0, through 1. The elevator chimed and stopped at the first floor. The doors opened. Jennifer found herself looking at the familiar main lobby of Metropolitan Hospital. The late-night receptionist sat at the front desk, typing on a computer. A janitor was mopping the floor near the entrance. Everything was normal, mundane, real. Jennifer stepped out of the elevator on shaking legs. She looked back at it, trying to determine which elevator she'd been in, but there was something wrong. This elevator was in the West Wing lobby, not the East Wing where she'd started. She'd somehow traveled not just vertically but horizontally through the building. The receptionist looked up and smiled. "Dr. Zhao? Are you all right? You look pale." Jennifer opened her mouth to respond, but what could she say? That she'd been taken to an impossible floor 15 levels below the basement? That she'd been chased by things that looked like doctors and patients from half a century ago? It sounded insane. "I'm fine," Jennifer managed. "Just tired. Long surgery." She walked toward the exit, desperate to get outside, to breathe fresh air, to confirm that she was really back in the normal world. But as she passed the receptionist's desk, something caught her eye. On the desk was a clipboard with a sign-in sheet for after-hours visitors. Jennifer glanced at it without thinking, and then stopped, her blood running cold. The most recent signature on the sheet was her own, but it wasn't from tonight. It was dated March 15, 1952. Below her signature, in handwriting that looked exactly like hers, someone had written, "Sub-basement Medical Research Facility Level 15. Jennifer ran. She burst through the hospital doors into the cold March night and kept running until she was blocks away from the building. She stood on a street corner, her breath coming in great gasps that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The next day, Jennifer called in sick to her shift. And the day after that, when she finally returned to the hospital, she requested a transfer to a different department in a different building. Her supervisor was surprised but approved the request. Jennifer did some research during her time away. She combed through old hospital records, newspaper archives, anything she could find about Metropolitan Hospital's history. What she discovered made her wish she hadn't looked. In the 1940s and early 1950s, Metropolitan Hospital had been involved in a series of highly unethical medical experiments. They'd operated a research facility in the sub-basement, where they conducted procedures on patients without proper consent, experiments that would be considered torture by any modern standard. The facility had been shut down in 1952 after a scandal, and all records had supposedly been destroyed. But that wasn't all. According to one archived news article Jennifer found, There had been an incident in March 1952. A young doctor, a resident like Jennifer, had disappeared while working late one night. Her name was Jennifer Zhao. The article included a photograph. The woman in the picture could have been Jennifer's twin. Or rather, it was Jennifer. The same face, the same serious expression, everything identical except for the clothing and the grainy quality of the old photograph. Jennifer sat staring at that photograph for a long time. She thought about the signature on the receptionist's clipboard. She thought about the vintage medical ward she'd seen, about the people with black eyes who'd called her doctor and said they'd been waiting for her. She thought about time and how it might not work the way we think it does. How places with enough trauma, enough pain, might exist outside of normal time, creating loops and echoes that trap people across decades. Jennifer finished her residency, but she never specialized in research medicine like she'd planned. She became a general practitioner instead, working in a small clinic in the suburbs. She helps people, heals people, but she never works late at night, and she never, ever takes the elevator if she can avoid it. Because she knows now that elevators don't just move between floors. Sometimes, if conditions are just right, if the building is old enough, if enough terrible things have happened within its walls, if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, an elevator can take you between times. And the worst part, the thing that keeps Jennifer awake some nights, is a terrible suspicion she can't shake. She wonders if she really escaped at all. She wonders if the lobby she stepped into, the world she returned to, is really the present day, or if she's been trapped in some loop, living out the same events that the Jennifer Zhao of 1952 lived through. She wonders if one night she'll be working late and she'll step into an elevator, and it will take her back down to level -15. And this time she won't find her way out. This time she'll become one of those figures with black eyes, walking the corridors of that impossible place, waiting for the next lost soul to wander in. Sometimes Jennifer stands in front of a mirror and looks at her reflection, searching for any sign that something has changed, that she's not quite as real as she should be. And sometimes, just for a moment, her eyes seem darker than they should be. But that might just be the lighting. Closing. Those were 3 chilling true elevator stories that remind us that the mundane spaces we travel through every day might harbor horrors beyond our comprehension. From Sarah's encounter with the restless spirit of Gerald Pritchard at Mercy General Hospital, to Marcus's journey to an impossible floor at the CARLTON building, to Jennifer's descent into a nightmare that transcends time itself. These stories show us that elevators can be gateways to something far more terrifying than claustrophobia. These aren't just stories about mechanical failures or being trapped. They're about the thin barriers between our world and whatever lies beyond. They're about the spaces between floors, the moments when we're suspended in metal boxes, vulnerable and isolated. They're about the buildings we trust, the systems we rely on, and how quickly that trust can be shattered. The next time you step into an elevator, especially late at night, especially in an old building, remember these stories. Pay attention to which floor you're on. Watch the floor indicator. And if the lights flicker, if you feel that strange sideways lurch, if the doors open onto a hallway you don't recognize, maybe you should take the stairs instead. If you enjoyed these stories and want to hear more terrifying true tales, make sure you're subscribed to Dark Whispers with notifications turned on. We have more nightmare fuel coming your way, from haunted hospitals to cursed objects to places where reality breaks down. Hit that like button if these stories gave you chills, and drop a comment telling me, have you ever experienced something strange in an elevator? Have you felt that moment of wrongness, that sense that something was off? Share your stories. I read every comment, and your experience might be featured in a future video. Remember, the world is full of dark corners and strange spaces. Stay curious, stay cautious, and keep your eyes open, because you never know what might be waiting for you between floors. Until next time, this has been Dark Whispers. Sleep well, if you can.